Hello everyone, Nary here from DrakeWingGaming, and today I would like to read to you my original Creepypasta work, Don't Go to Cherry Hill. I wrote this story about 2 years ago and submitted it to Reddit. People really liked it, and I've always thought that reading creepypastas could be something I might be able to get into. I've always looked up to people like Creepypasta and Mr. Creepypasta, creepy ghost stories, Dr. Creepin', bedtime stories, all those great readers out there. Maybe this can be something I do. So, without further ado, pull up a nice chair, get real comfortable, and don't look over your shoulder, because there's no telling what can come up behind you when you're not paying attention. Alright, this is my story. Don't Go to Cherry Hill. When I was a kid, my dad told me to stay away from the old well on top of Cherry Hill. He always said the place was bad news, something sinister in the guise of comfort. There's something bad about that well, about that whole place, has the stink of evil about it, he'd say, in between huffs of his illegally imported Cubans. Dad had a cellar in town, and the cellar usually bought their stuff from the police department. People had a habit of overlooking that kind of thing in our cozy little town, how the law enforcement was pretty lax once you delved deep enough. This was why Cherry Hill was still open despite being officially closed to the public after a young girl vanished. The place has legend around it, myth and folklore created by a populace capitalizing on the one bit of wonder and mystery that could be found in their town. Cherry Hill was once a recreational spot, a park on a hill sort of thing. Families would picnic under the trees, kids would chase each other, dogs would chase the kids. It was a pretty relaxing place to be. That is until the night of October 13th, 1993, when horror struck our town. I was 12 years old at the time and hanging out with my friends in front of an abandoned apartment complex. The place was recently vacated because the owner was hauled in by the police after they found out he was using minors as couriers to transport drug packets to buyers. The place never had any tenants, and the sheriff had long suspected the owner was dealing in narcotics. But they left him alone until little Jimmy's father saw 3 packets of cocaine slip out of his backpack when he came home from school one day. It didn't take much pressure before Jimmy completely spilled the beans. The place was still in great condition, and we even found a way to wedge one of the doors open and slip inside to occasionally explore. The place had been ransacked by the cops, so there was nothing really left to get into, but it was still a nice place to fool around and play games. The place was pretty close to Cherry Hill, so we'd often just take a detour inside before heading off to hang by the old well. The hike up to the top was pretty exhausting, so we'd always pig out on junk food and soda before our trek. My friend Danny had snuck some Playboys from his dad's collection, and we were all gathered around, admiring the gorgeous women and chewing gum. Things were going smoothly that night. We hadn't run into Aaron's little gang, and the moon was full, painting the surroundings in an almost entrancing light. Life had been pretty good to us, and we were in no hurry to grow up. A horrific, blood-curdling scream echoed from the top of Cherry Hill, and we all turned our heads in fear and alarm. The scream had definitely come from a girl, but it sounded agonized, like a person in an unbearable amount of pain. We waited, expecting to see someone come running down the trail that connected to Willoughby Street. Not a soul was to be seen, and an eerie silence settled upon us. None of us wanted to say the words, but it was Garrett who spoke up. He was always the bravest and most adventurous of us, like he had something to prove. I guess growing up without your dad might make you a bit hardened or eager to make something of yourself. He said that maybe we should go check it out, that it sounded like someone needed help. None of us could deny that it sounded like bad news, but we weren't exactly eager to go jumping into the fire, so to speak. I voiced my dissent, as did Danny and Gary, but the other 4, Greg, Jonathan, Garrett, and Will, were in favor of setting out. It was a fair democratic process. Whatever decision had the most votes we would go with. Despite the majority being in favor, I could tell they were nervous. No other sound came from atop the hill, and you'd think that if someone screamed that loud, then they might call for help after. I didn't like the silence. It seemed unnatural to me. We ditched our candy and magazines in a hidden cache close by, hefting our backpacks and starting off towards the path that led up the hill. The walk was fun with friends around, but something about tonight just felt wrong to me. It's that feeling that you get when you just know that something is going to go wrong, that primal sensation that causes the hairs on the back of your neck to stand on end. We were about halfway up when a terrible aroma hit us, like the smell of sewers or piles of rotting meat. It was bad enough to make Garrett retch on the spot. He never did have a strong stomach. After stopping and having another vote to make sure we really wanted to do this, we continued to the top of the hill in short order. We approached a gate with a large wooden sign above that read, Cherry Hill, marking our point of return should we need to make a quick getaway. The gate was slightly ajar, the metal bars showing their age, with large discolored patches of rust. I'd read something in a newspaper about the mayor possibly ordering renovations and sprucing the place up again, but that was some time ago and had likely fallen through. Will held the gate open as the rest of us passed through, the terrible stench getting stronger the further we progressed. There was another smell now, more overpowering than the first, leaving a coppery aftertaste in my mouth. The well was a small walk inwards, through overgrown flora and tightly packed prairie fire crabapple trees. They were the reason this place was named Cherry Hill, as their leaves so closely resembled those of cherry blossom trees. When they were in bloom, it was quite a sight to behold, and their beauty was the only thing our town was known for. Gary and I were the first two to notice the ripped and flattened plants. A path had been formed quite forcefully through the brush, leaving flowers and twigs strewn about. Curiously, it seemed to lead directly to the well, and we were thankful for the clear shot. There was a tiled path, but it had been seized upon by overgrown and unkempt plant life, hidden completely from view now. This was as clear of a trail as we were going to get. The closer we got to the well, the worse the stench became. This was when we noticed the blood. There was a lot of it. A lot of it. The red stuff was splattered all around on the trees and grass, coating the stone base and opening of the well itself. All of us stopped at once, staring at the carnage that we had missed. A few of us were trembling with fear. I just felt numb. I didn't think any of us had ever seen this much blood before. And we had no idea what could have spilled so much of it. The gore-stained dress is what I noticed next, laying in several pieces, the largest draped over the mouth of the well. From the patch that wasn't stained, I could tell it had been white, and there was only one girl who had worn that kind of dress to school today. Rebecca, or Becky, as most of us called her, was a rather shy 10-year-old girl who was one grade below me. Not much was really known about her and her family. They mainly kept to themselves, but it was rumored that her dad was an ex-Marine who had been dishonorably discharged for disobeying some kind of order when he was deployed. As we gawped at the scene, I could only hope and pray that that dress didn't belong to her. She was always nice to me when I managed to get a few words out of her, and I didn't want anything bad happening to her. Whatever the case, it was clear that someone had been hurt bad, or possibly worse. Jonathan was the first to panic, saying that we shouldn't be here. None of us could argue with him, but Danny and Garrett started bickering over what to do next. Should we look around to see if the person needed help? The sheer amount of blood made it clear that that was not a wise option. Whoever or whatever did this was probably still around, and none of us were particularly thrilled about getting sliced up. I hated the idea of being a coward and taking flight, but I also hated the idea of not being alive even more. I told them that we were at risk just being around here, that whatever was out there could possibly be watching us now. We might be safe in a group, but just how long would that last? All that arguing was brought to a close when we heard a loud scraping sound coming from the well. It was getting closer to the top and increasing in speed. We broke into a sprint towards the park entrance, all pretenses of a coherent plan lost in translation as our fight-or-flight instincts took over. I turned around briefly, catching a glimpse of something peeking out of the well's rim. At the time, my mind was racing. I didn't have enough time to process what I had seen. Now, though, I still have nightmares about what I saw that night. As we reached the entrance, we looked back, still ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Nothing had followed us, but we heard an eerie hum in the air, like a deep rumbling that swept over us. It made my teeth chatter, and I could see a few of the guys were visibly shaken. I looked at Will, who was already staring at me. His eyes were wide, like they were staring straight through me. He had seen it too, maybe even gotten a better look than I. I didn't want to pry, though. He looked like he wasn't far off from a total breakdown. We all decided it would be best if we told someone about this, that getting adults involved would be for the best at this point. This was too big to just ignore. Becky might need their help. We all took one last look past the gate, staring in silence as the trees slowly swayed in the evening wind. We all expected something to come charging out at us, but all we heard was that creepy rumbling again. We jogged to the bottom of the hill. Instead of sprinting, that first bout had taken a lot out of us. It was fair to say that we had been thoroughly frightened by what had happened, even if we still had no idea exactly what occurred atop Cherry Hill. We ran straight to the police station, causing quite a scene as we rushed through the double doors. A couple of the deputies questioned us and brought some snacks, leading us to a waiting room where we could have some privacy and calm down. I noticed that Will was visibly shaking, prompting Danny to pat him on the shoulder. Most of the others were arguing about what the hell we'd gotten involved in. Garrett even going so far as to flat out say Becky was dead. I never wanted to punch someone more than I wanted in that moment, even more than Aaron when he tried to bully me. I clenched my fist as hard as I could, but kept myself restrained enough to just curse at him instead. It didn't feel as good, but it got my point across. There was no use in assuming the worst before you had all your facts laid out. Garrett waved his hands apologetically, quickly realizing he'd let his emotions get the best of him. My anger subsided, but a part of me regrettably agreed with him. I had never seen that much blood before. But that other thing that I saw when I looked back... The sheriff came in to see us, saying that he'd heard us saying some pretty wild, scary things. He was every bit the image of a stereotypical small-town sheriff. Overweight, red-faced, goofy, keeping all kinds of secrets to keep our town going. He was not a serious guy in any respect, but in that moment he could not have been more serious. He panned his gaze over each of us, asking which one wanted to go first. When no one wanted to be the first to speak, I stepped up to the plate. I started by telling him where we were hanging out that night, but not what we were actually doing there. You know, just some friends hanging out and playing cards. Not sure if he bought that, but he nodded his head. He was a kid once too, after all. He narrowed his eyes at me when I told him about the loud scream coming from atop Cherry Hill. The next thing he did was ask if we had gone to investigate, which most of us nodded to. He sighed and shook his head, chastising us for being so reckless and possibly putting ourselves in harm's way. He then asked the deputies to leave the room so he could have a word with us in private. After the door closed, he turned back towards us and asked us to describe exactly what we'd seen. We all recounted the same experience, detailing the blood-splattered scene and the shredded dress. We didn't leave out the part of the scratching noise we heard coming out the well, no matter how unbelievable it sounded. With some embarrassment, we told him about how we fled almost immediately, expecting him to laugh at our shared cowardice. Instead, he just stared, seemingly lost in thought as he focused on us. We finished by telling him that we had come here immediately after. I did not tell him about what I saw when we bolted. Neither did Will, who remained silent and glassy-eyed. To his credit, the sheriff simply nodded and opened up the drawer to his desk, pulling out a tall bottle of what looked like old whiskey. He asked us if we knew what it was. I certainly did. My dad liked a good drink from time to time, and he kept his liquor cabinet well stocked. Hell, he'd even let me have a few sips of the hard stuff from time to time. The sheriff pulled out a few glasses, asking who wanted a little taste. Some of us grabbed the glasses, including me, while the rest declined. He poured only a little bit into each glass, just enough to take the edge off. The other guys probably didn't know much about whiskey, and they quickly downed their samples. I sipped mine slowly, savoring the sharp kick followed by the warm sensation in my throat after. Everyone who gulped theirs down had their faces contorted in sheer revulsion, and a few of us, including the sheriff, couldn't help but snicker at their reactions. Afterwards, he took written statements from us before we were allowed to go home, and he made us swear on the Bible that we wouldn't tell a soul what we had witnessed. He had to open up an investigation, and expected a missing persons report to be filed the next day. Tomorrow, Everyone would know who was no longer in our town. The rest of that night passed by like a blur. We went our separate ways without much being said. I went home and tried to appear normal to my parents, holed myself up in my room and tried to cloud my mind with comics and TV, and got very little sleep that evening. I dreaded the next day, learning about who it was that got hurt. I prayed that whoever it was, that they were okay now, at the hospital being treated for minor injuries and whatnot. Such is the wishes of a kid, I guess, hoping for the best from a world that will subject you to every manner of cruelty. I kept having a nightmare whenever I would fall asleep, recalling what I had seen emerging from the well. It was so horrific, but I couldn't remember specific details when I'd wake up. Dreams and nightmares are funny like that, I guess. Begrudgingly, I readied myself for school and went downstairs, where both my parents were waiting for me with a knowing stare. Dad had his arms crossed and Mom had one hand on his shoulder. They looked the perfect part of concerned parents. Mom told me to sit down and said I could have whatever I wanted for breakfast. I told her I wanted blueberry Pop-Tarts covered in vanilla ice cream, and she set off preparing it without a word. My dad sat down and laid out the newspaper he'd been holding. The biggest title was exactly what I had feared most. Remains of young girl found on Cherry Hill. I wanted to tear my eyes away, but I read on, knowing the name I would see only a few words in. The victim, in fact, was Rebecca. Her parents were too shocked to add a blurb or comment to the article, so the writer was going by official police reports of what transpired last night. It said that the police had responded to an incident following an anonymous tip about an occurrence on Cherry Hill. The scene it described was exactly what we had come across. Blood everywhere, a single scrap of a dress, and bits of flesh. Thankfully, none of us were named, but the sheriff must have called my parents either late last night or this morning and told them our story. My dad pulled the paper away, folded it, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. What followed was some of the most uncomfortable moments in my life, just sitting there in silence, expecting my parents to say something. Perhaps I just didn't know what to say at the time. How could you know what to tell your child who saw the remains of a gruesome murderer? My dad eventually told me it was okay, and that if I needed to talk about it with someone, he and Mom would listen. I just nodded and stared blankly at them. I didn't know how to feel at that moment. Maybe this is what going through loss does. Becky wasn't very close to me, but imagining her not at school anymore, even never seeing her again, it somehow just made me feel numb inside. The bus ride to school was uncomfortable, to say the least. My friends and I sat in the back quietly while other kids stared back at us. We heard many of them whispering, but couldn't make out the words. We even caught a few glances from the bus driver. News travels fast to a small town. It doesn't take long for everyone to hear about something happening. About halfway to school, Will turned to me and said he didn't sleep well last night. This didn't surprise me, as I think most of us likely only managed to get a few hours if we were lucky. Then he said he had a few series of nightmares. I felt my stomach knot up when he told me that, like the damn thing had been turned inside out. I told him he was just overreacting, that he'd be fine in a few days. I remember the face, he muttered under his breath, the statement causing my skin to crawl. I wanted to be as far away from him as possible at that moment, even if he was my friend. I just wanted life to return to normal, for the status quo to be restored. I didn't want to be involved in this anymore. I just wanted to forget. You can't forget stuff like this. The things that stick with you, waiting at the edge of your thoughts. The other guys were lucky. They weren't dumb enough to turn around. Only Will and I had seen something peeking out of the well that night. We were all the outcasts at school. For a while, but not for the wrong reasons. People only knew that we had seen something horrible. It's only natural that they wanted to leave us be. Parents didn't want us telling their kids gruesome stories that would give them nightmares, so they told them to keep their distance. The teachers treated us a little differently, too. though in a nicer way. A few of them even bought us treats and took a little extra time to help us out with our homework if need be. The community was healing, and things were slowly going back to normal. Becky's murder was never solved, and her parents moved away, rather than deal with the grief of living in a town where their daughter was murdered. There were multiple investigations that went nowhere, inquiries into neighboring towns where the killer could have gone. Everything turned up cold, as if whatever happened that night couldn't be traced back to any tangible evidence. Will and I knew, though. It took me time to come to grips with it, but I know what I saw that night. It still haunts me, prowling through my nightmares. Sometimes I see after images of it when I wake up, receding into the shadows of my room. It has been years since that night that a little girl was butchered and our town was thrown into chaos. I realize that I didn't explain what happened after, but it's not necessary. There's no reason for me to expound on all the misery our group went through. Had we eventually all moved on with our lives? Most of the guys moved out of town, going out into the world. I was one of them. My parents weren't thrilled, but they understood my need to leave. I really thought things would get better after that having a job and going to school would fix my problems. I learned that no amount of distractions can completely heal the mental scarring that I went through. It's still there, at the edge of my thoughts in every waking moment. Still staring right at me with those black orbs. I cannot unsee all the blood. The tattered scraps of cloth that were the only things left of Becky. The horror that rose up from the well that night and robbing two parents of their little girl. Therapy had limited success. Staying in touch with some of the guys helped a little bit more. It never seemed to be enough, though, no matter how many bandages I put on that old wound. I noticed how well adjusted and happy they were compared to me, and it made me jealous. I also pitied them, in a way. They were completely oblivious to the terrible things this world harbored, to the thing that resided within the well on Cherry Hill. You know, you'd think that opening up about this would have helped me recuperate, and you'd be right, for a time at least. I told other people about my experience online, in forums designed for people like me who have seen things they really can't explain. It felt good being surrounded by those who understood what it felt like to be swallowed by this world. One guy got a lot of attention on the forums when he posted his experience about a beachcombing incident gone wrong. Something about a monster rising out of the sea and chasing he and his friends through a cave. Everyone loves a good sea monster encounter, no matter if it's true or a fabricated story. I wish mine was just a story. Some wild flight of fantasy and inventive imagination. I wish all of those sleepless or nightmare-infested nights were just a detail I added to garner sympathy from my readers. I wish Becky was just a character I created to add drama and suspense to a frightening murder mystery narrative. Everything I've written and said is true, like some sick cosmic joke being played on me. A horror story come to life, destroying lives in its wake. I still think of Becky's parents sometimes. If they were ever able to find closure and move on. How could they have closure? There wasn't enough left of their daughter to fill a cup. How do you go on after that? I won't lie. I've thought about going out early, ending things on my own terms. I guess I'm just too scared to do something like that. I hate to say it, but I definitely expected Will to go out that way. He was never the same after that night, so many years ago. I tried to stay in contact with him, even tried meeting up time to time when I went back to visit my parents. It's like he just dropped off the face of the earth. A few days ago, I received a couple letters in the mail. I expected them to be junk, but noticed that the letters were marked 1 and 2. I popped open the first letter, pulling out a bunch of crumpled newspaper clippings. I carefully laid out each one, my eyes scanning from headline to headline, absorbing the information presented to me. The clippings were taken from newspapers in my town, and each one seemed to be about mysterious sightings or pets going missing. Photos under the headlines showed bloodstains on fencing, doors, and other objects. To say I was disturbed would be putting it lightly, and I contemplated shelving the other letter for some other time. Ultimately, my curiosity got the best of me, and I pushed the clippings to the side of the table, opening the second letter. Within were several photos, varying in their level of wear. Curiously, the top of each photo was marked numerically, 1 through 4. Whoever had sent the letters and taken the photos had been very precise in what order they should be viewed in. The first photo was of something. The surrounding environment was a home with the lens pointed at someone's roof. There seemed to be an outline of a figure against the moonlit sky, perched up there. No real details were visible, just a long shape. The next photo was of some tracks in the muddy trail. I had to do a quick double take before passing it off. The tracks looked strange, like I'd never seen anything quite like them. The sole was large but narrowed toward the toes, which seemed to be unnaturally elongated. Something about them made me feel uneasy, and I pushed the photo away. Photo number 3 was a grisly sight. I turned the photo around to contemplate what I had just seen. When I flicked it around, I was no more prepared for the grim sight. It looked to be the remains of a large animal, likely a cow by the general shape, but utterly mutilated and torn to pieces. Organs and meat were scattered all around the ground, the shattered bones sticking out of the corpse. It looked like the poor thing had been run through a meat grinder. What little hide wasn't shredded was marked by deep lacerations that had gouged out large chunks of flesh and muscle. This animal had been butchered, and I wasn't keen on looking at it any longer. Nothing could have prepared me for the fourth picture, though. I slid it out, looking at the scene presented before me. The flash of the camera had illuminated a dark, grimy tunnel. Viscous slime clung to the walls, glistening from the harsh light of the flash. Various bits of debris and refuse were scattered around, though nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed something familiar. I dropped the picture and recoiled in horror, backing up from the table. There, at the very end of the tunnel, were 2 huge black eyes. A cold sweat overcame me and my heart rate shot up. I tried to implement my steps up from therapy, breathing in and out, clearing my mind, changing my focus, but none of it mattered. The eyes were all I could see now. The same eyes from my nightmares, the same eyes from that night on Cherry Hill. They were filled with an insatiable hunger, set in the head of something primal and terrible. They were portals to a history of incalculable suffering and misery, a roving abomination that destroyed lives and flayed dreams. I could swear the eyes in the picture were staring at me, promising that one day I'd be another victim. Seeing the photo made me remember the final details missing from my memory of that night. Those Stygian, jet-black orbs, a cavernous, fetid maw, and a little girl's arm hanging limply from it. I couldn't hold back the tears any longer, and I broke down right there. I kicked the table hard, hoping it would scatter the photos into some dark corner where I'd never find them. The final picture floated to the floor in front of me, face down. There was something written on the back, and I couldn't help but lean down to read it. To this day, I wish I hadn't. It's back. Will.